This outstanding book is essential reading for anyone who wishes to gain a better understanding of contemporary South Korean society, particularly the challenges faced by liberal and progressive reformers who have sought to overcome the legacies of neoliberalism and the developmental state during a time of expanding inequality. This is one of the very best books on contemporary South Korean politics and economics. The study is executed with precision. It is thoroughly and ethically researched. I have not seen that combination very often. It's really in discussions of academic texts. And it is theoretically ambitious. So I feel lucky to have Dr. Doucette with us today here to kick off his book tour across North America. And how many stops? Or 8 stops? 8 stops. But we're the first. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Doucette.
Thank you for such a warm introduction. I believe I need to put this on. Working. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Youngji, for a lovely introduction. Try to live up to all the praise anyway. So I just thought I'd maybe start with the cover image, which something I'm really pleased about. It's from the photo artist Doucette. I think maybe you've had a presentation about his work in the past, but he has such amazing work. The image doesn't give it justice here, but it has such amazing play of light and shadow and proximity in it that I quite love it. The image here isn't from the recent candlelight protests, as you might think it is, but it's from the 2008 protests against Kim Young-bak, his kind of relaxing of restrictions on U.S. beef, as well as a bunch of the other things he was doing to the state at that time. And I guess why I chose it in terms of my own personal feelings and beliefs is it kind of shows, for me, it's a reminder that things like economic reform aren't merely kind of technical questions, if you will, but are something that involve this kind of broader question of the legacy of democratization, right? So in the shadow there, you see what I believe is probably the Ihanyo Yolsa, like Memorial or Martyr Society. So this sense of like, these sometimes seemingly technical issues of having this question of these deeper legacy, this need to fulfill past demands and goals. My book, though, mostly looks at the secrets of reform after the Candlelight Revolution, but kind of in relation to this kind of 20 or so year kind of project of reform in the period after the Asian financial crisis present. But yeah, what do you need to know about that kind of period? So for those of you, I guess you're studying the Candlelight Revolution in class, or those who aren't, there's a large citizens uprising, if you will, or mass act of social disobedience in 2016, 2017, that was provoked by a number of different issues and ultimately led to the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye, including collusion with their personal advisors and other areas of the state, regulatory failure in the sense of the Save-All disaster, and a general sense of growing inequality in society. This is around the time where the term "helchosen" becomes popular. So it isn't necessarily her actions herself, the kind of web of actors around her that in many ways provoked this. I have a series of protest posters here with Chae Soon-sil and Samson Jae-young. So this is a really inspiring event for many places and people around the world, led to her impeachment and a new liberal administration from the pro-democratic bloc, that sort of larger historical bloc of actors involved in the Democratic Party, civil society actors, trade unions, and such. And really, it led to a strategic opportunity for them not to create some kind of new system per se, de novo, but really to institutionalize a set of ideas they've had for a long time and have debated about the nature of Korean democracy, about the nature of Korean political economy. And really, it was a moment of great optimism reformers spoke of creating a Rooseveltian 20-year reign, right? They really thought that the conservatives are banished for a while and we're going to secure the hegemony to rule for 20 years. And with it, a lot of Rooseveltian talk of like a New Deal and the building of strong economic and social institutions. But what went wrong? Because here we are a few years later and we have the return of the conservative. So in office, Moon pledged to eradicate what he saw as the deep-rooted evils and create a society in which opportunities are equal, processes are fair, and outcomes are just. Sometimes he used the term economic democracy to talk about the kind of political economic system he wanted, as this is a term long debated on the Korean left. Yeah, he said he'd create a people-centered economy oriented towards economic and democracy and peace, a system that could address big sort of issues in society, the power of the chaebol, the legacy of anti-communist prosecution, the various forms of repression and wrongdoing that had provoked the Candlelight Revolution to begin with. But after 5 years in office, the chaebol seemed stronger than ever. Labor was discontented with the trajectory of reform. Inequality, there's much left to address, especially in the housing market and the Conservative Party in power and the Democratic Party in disarray. So there's, things didn't go as planned, to say the least. The 20-year reign never materialized. So kind of thinking of this moment of failure, if you will, I think it provides a kind of sear for us to rethink in some ways how we do Korean political economy, right? To understand kind of what went wrong. So there's a few arguments that I advance in the book. One is that this event of the Candlelight Revolution and its aftermath provide a kind of ripe opportunity for scholars to critique and revise how we do Korean political economy. For the study of Korean political economy has long been dominated by the developmental state, the theory of the developmental state, which I don't feel is quite adequate or up to the task to understand these sorts of dilemmas, right? To look at the problem of Korean political economy through the lens of a pro-democratic bloc, through its kind of intricate relations between political and civil society, that assembling that bloc and instituting policy involves. There's a bit of a normative critique here too, that it's in many ways time to kind of move away from this celebration, often critical of high growth models, to other sort of economic problems, such as inequality, labor repression, other dimensions of injustice, if you will. So there's a big shift that I'm trying to do here, right? Rather from idealizing the developmental state in the sense of praising a kind of, elite bureaucracy, which is what often animates the literature, and that's just uncritically celebrating growth. I want to look at the challenges encountered by pro-democratic forces and shift even our metrics more toward the contours of contemporary inequality. And I think the perfect place to do this, or the argument that I make, it's not the only way to do this, is to look at that kind of site of the nexus between political and civil society. I'm really interested in reformers who have come from social movements, who have gone into the state, and the kind of challenges they have faced there. And I think that's a really great place to study it. And there's a few arguments I make that come from looking at it through that standpoint, right? So one, that the economic imaginary itself of economic democracy, the imaginary itself, has increasingly become more technical and depoliticized over the years. The reforms that were part of Moon's plans for economic democracy, or what he called a society that respects labor, lacked poor coordination with the labor movement itself. And thirdly, that in general, there's a complicated politics of legitimation, or what I call a politics of personality, that in some ways undermined or made some of his reforms difficult. Which also speak to some other issues, such as the resilient power of the conservative bloc, that I hope I'll touch on at the end of the presentation. Okay, so this is a little bit of an introduction. Thought I structure my presentation as this. First section, I'll take you through a little bit of my critique of developmental state theory, which I criticize for its democratic deficit, its lack of attention on the sort of actors I want to study. I'll bring you through what I'm calling the post-developmental state, which is very different than the developmental state itself. And then I thought I'd look at those three arguments a little bit in the dilemmas on economic democratization. I don't have time to go through them all, so this is going to be a very crude presentation, if you will. I think I'll stay more closely on the labor aspects and some aspects of reforming the prosecution is quite topical in light of current events, and then a little bit of conclusion and discussion. And I think I'll try to keep it to 45 minutes. Right. We started about 10 after, so, yeah, and 5 then. So I guess some of you, how many undergrads are here? Have you been reading the developmental state theory, or is this your first time learning about the developmental state? This is your first time. So it's a perennial topic in Korean political economy. I'm sure you must get it in any Korean studies program. A very, very popular theory, of course, across disciplines. I'm a geographer. Geographers are interested in the uneven development of capitalism, including the uneven development of institutions. The developmental state often stands in for a kind of variety of capitalism that you find in East Asia, and that's it's often engaged with in geography, even if we don't necessarily subscribe to theory and methodology, but these theories have embraced. But nonetheless, a very powerful presence. To refresh you, if you haven't been introduced to it, this is a kind of theory that came out of this turn to the state. It's like that's an explanation for economic growth in the 1980s. A number of its theorists are called neo-Weberians, and that, unlike Weber, who saw the state as an adjunct to the market, they saw the state as a really important actor in its own, driving the economy. And they argued that really behind the success of rapid East Asian economic development was this thing they called the developmental state. But they had a very particular understanding of it. In particular, they identified the state with the structure and organization of elite bureaucracies. So the state wasn't this kind of combination of political and civil society. It was for them the structure of elite economic bureaucracies. So they saw as kind of autonomous, separated from society. So really an identification of the state with the elite bureaucracy, which was autonomous, even insulated from society. So they argued that this kind of insulation or autonomy allowed it to govern the market. It was an anti-neoliberal ideal type, if you will. It was sort of saying, listen, these countries didn't let the market sort of decide and pick the winners. It was the state who was doing it. They were very active. They repressed financial markets. They allocated capitals to industries. They controlled everything, if you will. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's kind of the gist of their theory. But there's some problems with it, if you will. One is basis of rationality wasn't really a kind of sensual one, if you will. It was kind of just an ideal type that is associated with a kind of professionalized bureaucracy. It isn't rationality in the sense of the cognitive. It's a notion of rationality that left out emotion and affect, anxiety, different things that affect real people. And it was an ideal type. The theory itself really began to decline after the Asian financial crisis because the rationality at the core of the state could not be found. And thus the research program of the developmental state kind of went into decline. It's still around. There's often the kind of after the fact discovery that, oh, it wasn't the financial ministry wasn't autonomous, but it was construction, like finding autonomy in different places. But this kind of weakens many of the theory's prescriptions. Because for developmental state theorists, the state wasn't autonomous. You couldn't find that autonomy, then the state was predatory. And you couldn't really, affirm its presence or, I guess, credit it with development. It's a very parsimonious theory, if that makes sense to you, right? State is either developmental or it's not, right? There's kind of no in between. So, the financial crisis really was a crisis for developmental state theory. And it really couldn't, if it could ever explain development in the high growth period, I think it had some success, but even during the kind of peak of the developmental dictatorship, as some say, I don't think it explained everything. Things were much more complex. The state wasn't simply elite bureaucrats. It was an alliance between many different actors, religious figures, politicians, many different actors. But yeah, so even in the time period, I don't think you could locate autonomy. It was certainly much harder to find after the Jew democratic uprising, the kind of consolidation of democracy. So it kind of lacked the ability to kind of understand this kind of interaction between political and society. And there's a number of different reasons for it. When coming up with their ideal type of state autonomy, even the more liberal theorists like Peter Evans, who came with the idea of embedded autonomy, the idea that autonomy is embedded with social networks, they rejected a focus on legitimacy and legitimation, right? In my opinion, embedded autonomy skews towards a more democratic appraisal in that it has this idea that the state needs social partners to implement development. But he was adamant that his theory was not about legitimation. Manuel Castells, not a developmental state theorist, but someone who did use the term, made the argument that developmental states were about legitimacy, about states that try to make themselves legitimate for pursuing development. And Evans rejected this. He's like, no, it's not about legitimacy. It's about autonomy, capacity. Legitimacy is just something, it's icing on the cake. It's a beautiful thing. So this was kind of problematic because, I think most people think that legitimacy is an important category. Many of the mentors of the neoliberarians themselves kind of believed that the state was a combination of effectiveness and legitimacy, right? What it's doing and how it's perceived by a political system. So this is part of the democratic deficit right there. Another sort of problem with it is something that I find is there's a kind of awkward affinity between awkwardness and kind of shared explanation between developmental state theorists and many of the people who praised the developmental dictatorship, if you will. Now, I'm not saying that developmental state theorists are kind of right-wing, pro-authoritarian theorists. They're not. Certainly, they are very critical of the neoliberal structural adjustment in the 1990s. They had a sense that more varieties of capitalism were a good thing, but often in their praise for state-led planning, they did sound a lot like some of the admirers of the Park Chung-hee system. For instance, scholars such as Robert Wade really kind of prescribed, thought this idea of insulating the state from society could be a good thing, right? But this argument is not so different than conservative economists like Ja Sung-hee. I don't know if you know him. He's the chairman, or I don't know if he's still the chairman of the Park Chung-hee Memorial Society. He's written phrases such as, the genius of Park Chung-hee was his economization of politics. He didn't let politics interfere with the economy. There's a kind of awkward similarity or resonance between those two things. So this kind of creates some concerns about the normative orientation of developmental state theory. I think there's some other issues. I do a bit of, I'm not going to recite it here, but I do a bit of an epistemological critique of neo-Weberian state theory. That is not your average way to critique the developmental state theory. Mostly it's often an empirical critique saying, oh, you neglected this sector. But I wanted to kind of really understand how these theorists were making their ideal types and even where that method comes from, how that method constructs concepts and such. I hope you enjoy that chapter. It's evil to write, but I liked it. There's like a 1-page long footnote there, which I'm quite proud of, but it's in a footnote because it's optional. I also, in writing the book too, I was also interested in the kind of newer critical literature on Weber, which I think applies to the neoliberarians as well. This is a recent kind of critical and post-colonial literature that kind of go after Weber's method and his understanding of culture. Sarah Ferris's work on Max Weber's theory of personality is really interesting here. She makes the kind of stirring argument that Weber's understanding of rationality is connected to his understanding of what he called Asiatic non-personality. He made this argument that people in Asia lacked the ability to kind of create meaning, to pull themselves out of the mud, he said. And then he kind of used this kind of depiction to say that this is also what bureaucracy was like. So for Weber, the counterpoint to bureaucracy was the kind of charismatic politician who would come in and shake it up and give it a mission, much like a kind of Trump who comes in and breathes life into the bureaucracy. I can't believe I just said that sentence, but that was his thing. In some ways, what the neo-Bavarians are doing are inverting this thing, rather than a kind of personality-less person. They saw in the economic bureaucracy the passionate devotion to a cause, right? So this idea of the kind of virtuous bureaucrat, the helm of the developmental state, kind of collectively pursuing kind of a project of national development. But that's an ideal type, and one I don't think actually works in reality. Of course, it has some truth, but you really need to read these things in terms of the complexity and contradiction rather than its kind of uncritical assumption. Meritocratic planners planning everything. We need to be careful that our descriptions don't turn into celebration and prescription. Here I'm kind of reading this kind of critique. It also aligns with a lot of the debate in Korea, which unfortunately I don't think developmental state theorists interact with enough, about studying the developmental state and cognate things like the historiography of Park Jung-hee, the great intellectual Baek Nak-jung has written in the context of Park Jung-hee historiography that a serene disregard of the sufferings of people who lived through this period as some collateral damage in any march of modernization not only would be infuriating to those who had suffered, but would in all probability negatively affect the scholarly work in question. So what he's arguing, therefore, is a really critical understanding the period of the developmental dictatorship that takes into account doesn't just praise the bureaucracy or the genius of Park Jung-hee, but really looks at those who suffered, those who felt injustice. In political economy in Korea, Lee Byung-chun's theory of the developmental dictatorship is doing something similar, this idea of trying to grasp both the darkness and the light, although there are people who object that you can separate the darkness and the light. Cho Hee-yeon's idea of a developmentalist regime is doing a similar thing. It's a much more broader relational understanding. So this is kind of where I'm coming from. I situate my own contribution as a Gramscian approach. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that I have a very different understanding of the state, not as a kind of ideal type that's identified with the economic bureaucracy, but as something that's much more relational and processual, right? So Gramsci argues that you can't, the state itself is a relation between political and civil society. It's changing. You can't narrow it down and externalize it from society. Methodologically, of course, you can study political society and civil society confusedly in time, if you will, but ontologically, they're tightly connected. They're changing. They're dialectical. And this is a very different idea of what the state is. It also has a completely different way of understanding intellectual activity. So rather than creating a kind of ideal type, if you will, which is something that Weber did, it's a very abstract method. Gramsci has a different approach. So to study the state isn't simply to come up with an idea of it, but it's really to study the actors who are shaping it in the present. It's to engage with those actors and their ideas of the state. It's something very different. It's a practice rather than simply a conceptualization. So I sort of play with Gramsci in this sense to argue that, rather than having this ideal type, we need to work with existing projects on the ground, even align ourselves with them if that is what it takes to understand the challenges they face. I mean, that doesn't mean you uncritically endorse what those projects are doing, but I think there's room here for what I call interested interaction between the standpoint of people trying to change the sort of legacy of developmentalism and neoliberalism. There's a difference between that kind of approach and kind of a more like disembodied, kind of positive, what a kind of ideal type of state should be. So that's kind of where I come from. It broadly aligns with the post-colonial research agenda. Many people see Gramsci as a post-colonial theorist, or at least he has a big influence, but I think it gets you to that engagement. It doesn't necessarily suffice itself, but it gets you to, or encourages you to engage with local or different intellectual traditions, and the real material concerns that they are facing. I kind of deal all that in chapter 1, the densest chapter. I hope you enjoy it. But if you don't want to read the that you can easily skip. Okay, then, if I'm not doing an ideal type, what do I mean when I talk about the post-developmental states? So it's not an idealized model of growth. I'm not saying, oh, you can have a post-developmental state, they can have one. But rather, for me, it's a complex problem, right, that has structural and practical dimensions. And so in the structural problem, it's characterized by a number of different things: slowed economic growth, financial expansion, and neoliberal reform, things we associate with neoliberalism, along with residual developmentalist institutions such as the chaebol, the continued subordination of labor, the importance of the export economy, if you will, which is only growing. So that's kind of some of the structural relations. There's different ways you can understand it too structurally, but at least for the purpose of this book, that's how I understand it. But I'm more interested in the second element, which I see it as a kind of political dilemma, one that is trying to address this structure, and that is animated by a lack of a substantive alternative to developmentalism or neoliberalism, and a gradual exhaustion of economic democracy as a progressive imaginary for an egalitarian economic system. I would love to call it something else, like a fledgling social democracy or something else, but I think this lack of a cohesive alternative is why I find that the term useful. This fact that there hasn't been a radical break, if you will, that things are amorphous and a new model hasn't been found. So I like that more strategic characterization of what a post-developmental state is, and some sort of ideal type that you can kind of compare to lots of different places. But they're dialectically related, right? A structural condition and a political project aimed at overcoming, but that has not yet been successful. So what are some of those structural contours? Yeah, let's go through a few of them. Since the 1990s, there's been growing inequality, right? The financial crisis radically changed the contours of income. And you can see it on this graph. The thick black line is the income of the top 10%. As you can see, it increases considerably, while the income of both the middle 40% and the bottom 50% have declined relatively speaking, right? So it's in this new period of growing inequality. The rise of irregular work is really important here. Korea has some of the largest incidents of irregular work in the OECD. The largest, I think, it's comes second. It changes. Here you can see it still after the crisis at a relatively high level. This is a conservative or an official way of measuring non-regular work or irregular work. Called in Korea. The black line is the total of non-regular workers, the share total wage and salary workers. You can see it's distinctly gendered. Women are way more likely to have non-standard jobs. Temporary labor, dispatch labor, day labor, disguised subcontracting, all sorts of non-regular jobs than men. Once again, this is a really high number for an entire workforce. It's also a conservative number. Right after the crisis, the numbers sort of shot up. They were never great. Korea, I don't want to romanticize the developmental period as this era of full employment. That was always partial. It's still always easy to hire and fire people to some degree. It shoots up. In 2004, they introduced this new categorization, which is what is captured here. It doesn't capture everything, like people who are only in jobs for 12 months or people who don't have full insurances. It's mostly non-regular work based on status. You can see it's remained high. During the Moon Jae-in period, it jumps twice. The first jump is artificial in the sense that it comes with a revised statistical categorization for irregular work to include what are called dependent contractors. It's kind of like if your university food services was contracted out, but those workers were dependent on the university for like the execution of their jobs. The second one is COVID, and some of it is probably organic, related to the Korea, China, Japan tensions of that period, which also led to some changes. So I don't want to say like, oh, look, Moon totally failed, but it shoots up. Some of that is a statistical, some of it's COVID and some of it's statistical. The point is that it's been high and it remains high. With that comes uneven social protection. As you can see here, irregular workers are less likely to be covered by the 4 major insurances, especially health insurance and pension. The glass is half full here. I mean, the comparison here is between 2007 and 2022. I mean, in the mid-1990s, not all these systems were even in place. So there is not a bad story here, but your status, regular worker or irregular worker, really does matter in terms of what your insurance, what your social protection is. That's a problem, but glass half full problem, I think. Financially, the economy has completely changed, but maybe not in the way that's often thought to be. Remember, if you've been around the social sciences for a while, there's been these great debates about financialization. They're often applied and even used in Korea to describe these changes. This idea that society is turning into this casino capitalist neoliberal financial model. I think those arguments only go so far when it comes to Korea. There's some arguments that can be made that when it comes to the chaebol themselves, many have become less financialized depending on how you measure it. One feature of the developmental dictatorship, right, was the highly indebted corporate sector, right? So debt to equity ratio almost reaching 500% during the heyday. After the Asian financial crisis, these are forced down to around 100%. In effect, much of the chaebol's debt is socialized unless they're paying a lot less interest to their creditors. So in that sense, they're not so dependent on debt anymore. But that doesn't mean that finance didn't expand and that debt didn't go somewhere else. In contrast, households take on a huge amount of debt after the financial crisis, right? Korea was often regarded as this high savings economy, which is sort of true, as savings were funneled through the banking system to support export expansion. After the Asian financial crisis, those financial surpluses go somewhere else, often into household lending. So right now, Korea sits at about a year ago, it sits at a nearly 200% household debt to income ratio. I think American subprime crisis was about here. So this is a huge concern. It's fueled the real estate boom, speculative property bubbles, and it's a concern for both progressive and conservative administrations. Right. So you can see like elements of, anyways, there's elements of neoliberalism, financial expansion, but it's not universal, and overall it's uneven. When it comes to the chaebol, there's often fears of financial takeover, that they'd be taken over by private equity and foreign hostile funds. I would say the answer is opposite. Of course, right after the crisis, there was a fire sale of assets. Firms and especially banks were bought up, but the firms that survived the Asian financial crisis have in many ways consolidated their power. How do the chaebol maintain their power over their firm? Partially through a system called circular shareholding. What do I mean by that? It's interesting because we think of the chaebol families as kind of all powerful, but in many cases, they only own a small amount of their firm, like in terms of direct family ownership. This is from the FTC, Fair Trade Commission. This is family ownership as a percent of the whole, based on Samsung Group in 2023. You can see they only owned like 1-point-something%. But through circular ownership, so for having their subsidiaries kind of owning fractions of shares of other firms, they're able to cement control. This is like a simplified version of what that looks like. So the ruling family might own most of one firm, which owns a bunch of another firm, This often changes as you try to pass down ownership and control to different generations. I don't know where it is right now with Samsung. A long time ago, it was with the Everland amusement park. Then it's long shifted. So an interesting system, right? That parsimonious categories like developmental state or neoliberalism don't really fully help us understand, right? There's elements of the old system, powerful chaebol, subordination of labor, but also of other things going on, right? Highly indebted households, speculative bubbles, and stocks and real estate. So that's kind of what I see as the structural problem. what are some of the challenges that reformers have encountered in trying to address it? So I'll talk about three. I guess the first is the chaebol problem. And often this is what the phrase economic democracy has come to signify. Originally, I think it had a much more egalitarian sense of social transformation, that economic democracy was indeed building a strong welfare state, an alternative economic model. But over the years, it has become diminished into loosely a pro or anti-chaebol register. But it always wasn't so. The economic democracy movement in many ways emerges out of the civil society movement in the 1990s, who embraced minority shareholder activism, like buying shares in the firm, as a tactic, right? And this is not a bad idea. It gives activists a voice. And for many in the Chamyeonde, a venerable Korean NGO or a civil society organization, it was a way to speak to some of the broader injustice society. That group wasn't all just economists, it was people who were trying to use this tactic for different things. But slowly, I think many of those reformers themselves embraced a more economistic understanding of what that activism should be, and align their ideas more with a kind of shareholder value view of the firm, right? That if you give powers to shareholders, they would guide the firm in a better direction. They wouldn't just take it over and strip its assets, although that would happen. This would lead to a market in corporate control away from the ruling families and lead to professionalized management. But this isn't so much a social vision of economic reform. It's one that aligns with a set of property owners, right? This idea that shareholder activists become property owners, and thus that is where their agency is. And that sort of rubbed other activists in the civil society movement the wrong way. And kind of in the early 2000s, you see a kind of move against the minority shareholder movement. For people who actually quite like the developmental state idea, who believe that you need to protect the chaebol in the name of creating a more equal welfare state, if you will. Camps are represented on one hand. Kim Sang-cho and Jang Ha-sun were really influential in the minority shareholder movement, came to occupy prominent places as advisors and policy chiefs, et cetera, in later governments. Kind of the against the minority shareholder movement is you might know Chang Ha-jun Chang, the famous development economist. Some of you might know that Chang Ha-jun and Jang Ha-sun are cousins, which gives us the kind of feeling of family feud. Nonetheless, I would say both embraced highly idealistic visions of what economic democracy should be, that are either kind of pro or anti-chaebol. The late economist Chung Tae-in, progressive economist, criticized both for prioritizing intra-class relations, seeing the problem of economic democracy as really just a conflict between owners, rather than a set of important interclass relations to be solved, right? So seeing the project of economic democracy not as a project of equality, right, between classes, but really just prioritizing this conflict between two types of owners that both kind of uncritically idealize. Kim Sang-cho set up the Center for Good Corporate Governance and eventually launched a fund called the Korea Good Corporate Governance Fund that wouldn't invest in companies that did circular shareholding, only those who had good financial management. CalPERS, California Public Employees Pension Service, was a big investor in that. I think they invested about $400 million. As a word of caution to idealizing capitalism, it failed tremendously. It lost like 3/4 of its funds in several years. So there's a bit of a lesson there. Chang Ha-jun's camp, I think, was equally kind of parsimonioustic, right? Saying overly, I think, praising the chaebol. Many of them themselves cut their teeth in the democracy movement. One person in his orbit who I have a lot of respect for was a former left nationalist activist in the 1980s, you know, had been arrested, spent time in prison, but he had come to embrace some pretty strong pro-table perspectives. He said to me once in an interview, he said, if I had to choose between Park Chung-hee and neoliberalism, I choose Park Chung-hee. But my response is, why should that be the choice? Why should you be kind of casting these things as two kind of completely opposite things? In some ways, two odious choices, right? Why do you have to choose between those? But that's kind of how they saw it. A sense that the table was under threat from finance, you needed to protect them, or that you needed to restructure them into this kind of shareholder model. It isn't really an egalitarian vision of table reform anymore, I think, when it becomes reduced to these two sides. And so these sides sort of crystallized during the 2012 elections, when economic democracy, I think, was at its peak circulation. But I think, unfortunately, they haven't really changed since then. Moon appointed many Kim Sang-cho as advisors. They did some relatively cosmetic corporate governance reform, and that was sort of it. And then he eventually pardons or paroles Lee Jae-young from Samsung and embraces the kind of pro-table. So that there's strong limitations there of what economic democracy. Yeah, so gradually a depoliticized understanding of economic democracy that reduces it simply to table reform. It doesn't really explore many of the other alternatives out there, stronger industrial democracy or employee co-determination through appointing, you know, worker members on boards. There's many different ways we can understand economic democracy, co-ops, there's many other examples, but unfortunately it became confined. So interclass relations are really important. And there too, the story hasn't been amazing. So as part of his general economic reform push, Moon argued that he was going to create the labor respecting society. And this itself was a vision for like a better system for labor that had some key elements, raising the minimum wage, which he did, the regularization of non-standard workers, the promoting regularization through the public sector, reduction of working hours, 2-hour work week, the use of social dialogue between labor, business, and government to do it, and the finally the ratification of the International Labor Organization's core conventions on freedom of association, which Korea had not signed, not ratified. These are very important for labor. If you know much about how irregular work has been policed, it's very hard for Korean workers to strike legally because their rights are constrained, particularly for irregular workers, because they don't have a right to, they only have the right to bargain with their direct employers. But if you're an irregular worker, if you're that canteen staff in your university and you're being supervised by a using firm who are in effect your employer, you want to bargain with them and be able to take collective action. But that easily becomes illegal in Korea. And unfortunately, over the last 20 years, the government has encouraged the use of civil suits for collective action. So individuals can be sued to death, or can have huge amounts of money taken from them, their mortgages, their incomes garnished for engaging in collective action. Most countries limit the amount of damages that can be pursued. Like in England, for instance, only £1,000 a day, and that can only be taken from the union. Whereas in Korea, individuals can be persecuted for obstruction of business, for many things that are just ordinary collective action. So this was also seen as a way of resolving some of the injustice. Yeah. Again, the glass was half full here. So part of this is Moon wanted to reinvigorate the social dialogue body, the body where workers, employers, and government meet. And he kind of looked for some inspiration. Before the Candlelight Revolution, some of that was provided by the city of Seoul, which ran its own labor policy, which in a sense Moon kind of copied for his Gyeongsan-o Economic, Social, and Labor Council. Seoul, for instance, introduced its own policy that was called the City That Respects Labor, that kind of tried to use social dialogue. It brought in a lot of active former veteran activists from the labor movement and from like venerable labor supported or pro-labor NGOs like the Korea Labor and Society Institute, kind of designs its policy. It had some victories in the climate of conservative national administration. It had various features that under Park Won-soon, the city was able to regularize many workers, in the city government and eliminate the amount of temp labor. They promoted worker participation and management in the firms they invested in. Some success, tried to institute a living wage, different welfare policies, some very interesting things too. They recognized emotional labor as a kind of category of work to help regulate things like call center workers. They tried to bring in diverse public interests into social dialogue, so not just unions, and the unions did participate in various dialogues, but also self-employed youth, women workers, even small and mid-sized businesses. So there's a kind of interesting thing going on with the labor policies in Seoul. It's a good book about it, perhaps a little bit rosy-eyed, but it explains many of the policies nonetheless. Moon, I think, was very impressed by these policies and brought in many of the KLSI reformers into the ESLC, or people who knew about their policies, and tried to do something similar to the national level social dialogue body. But it didn't really work out either. But it could have been very interesting. It was run by many venerable ex-trade unionists or pro-labor actors. In some ways, it was a shame it didn't work. So why was that? The main sort of progressive or democratic trade union body, the KCTU, was distrustful of it to begin with. They remembered the trauma of the grand social compromise during the Asian financial crisis, where essentially they were forced to accept new laws that led to mass layoffs and the expansion of temporary work. They did not want to be seen as agreeing to that again. They really speak of it as a trauma, a trauma that hasn't been overcome, that prevents them from participating in national level social dialogue with the government. Which is not exactly 100% true. It's more this idea of creating a social compromise. The KCTU does participate in things like the minimum wage committee and some other specific type dialogues. Moon didn't necessarily use dialogue to handle some of these other tasks, such as increasing the minimum wage, pursuing table reform, or even contract regularization. These are things that actually social dialogue could have been useful for if you wanted a more egalitarian vision of table reform, for instance. He did pursue regularization, but it was often in a very complicated way. So without kind of strong labor representation, each ministry so part of the plan was to use the public sector to regularize work and promote regular contracts, but without sort of labor at the table, the way it was done was very haphazard and problematic. So for instance, the famous case here is the Incheon airport. It used to employ a lot of temp workers. What it did is it converted those temp workers into like indefinite term contract workers, which is like a somewhat permanent contract without benefits, and then hired them through a kind of special subsidiary. So not a temp agency, but not their direct employer. So it's kind of a weird form of regularization, if you will, like kind of creating a second tier type of worker, but certainly something that's better than gig economy work where you're hired and fired. But it's a complicated issue, but it wasn't necessarily the regularization that many wanted. There are a few other problems with the social dialogue body as designed. One was the sense that workers being asked to bargain over policies that kind of rolled back. So for instance, the attempt to create more after instituting the 52-hour work week, and then try to roll it back by allowing kind of flexible overtime. And an attempt to use the body to bargain those very core labor rights, if you will, that in some ways took away some of their progressive nature. So I don't know about you, but the ILO rights are good. Their freedom of association is not just a labor right, but a fundamental human right. If you're a good liberal, you should sort of accept those rights without condition. But what they try to do was try to limit them through negotiations. So in the end, although Korea ratified the ILO, it revised its domestic labor laws in a slightly problematic way that still included many of those restrictions on workers' rights, like your ability to bargain with your employer. There's not much protection for disruptive political acts. There's other restrictions in place. So a very problematic approach to fundamental labor rights. Okay, I'm gonna try to wind up, going a little bit longer than I like, but got to talking. The third area, it's where I see a dilemma, if you will, some progress, but also difficulty, involves the problem of what to do with the prosecution. But nonetheless, by this time, by late 2019, I think there's growing discontent with the trajectory of reform, table reform in labor. And many well-meaning reformers or activists from those NGOs who went to the state begin to question their position. Some felt like paper, if you will. On the one hand, their presence had helped legitimize the liberal administration, sort of showing that it believed in pro-democratic goals, but they felt like a strong progressive agenda had stalled. When it comes to other reformers, there's a more complicated and problematic part. I may get into trouble for some things I'm about to say here, but a kind of scandal emerged, which those who are watchers of contemporary Korean politics will be aware of, around the nature of prosecution reform. So Moon appoints a very charismatic legal reformer, former democracy activist named Cho Guk, to spearhead reform of the prosecution. And in a very weaponized way, the prosecutors begin to investigate him, but they find some evidence of minor corruption, a little bit similar to the school admission scandal here in the US. You had Cho is found to have used their influence to get their daughter into private schools and universities. And this leads to a lot of disillusionment to some young people, and is kind of weaponized by the right. Certainly the investigation and punishment of Cho Guk and his wife were way beyond their acts, but it leads to a kind of tricky problem in Korean politics. Basically, the administration supports Cho, and you have a series of protests for and against him. Prosecution reform really becomes seen as support for or against Cho Guk during this time. There's a kind of problematic politics of personality, if you will, here, that actually obscures some of these broader dilemmas that we see here, right? So Cho at this time is trying to take away some of the prosecution's powers of indictment investigation. But many of his critics on the left point to the fact that it's not really anchored in a broader social vision of legal reform. They note that the way the labor law has been revised hasn't been good. The administration refused to pass a comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation. There hasn't been significant table reform. I think this is an important argument. Again, I don't want to understate the damage in many ways this did. If you have friends in civil society organizations, a lot of them are really torn apart about this question of support for or against Cho Guk. Yeah, especially in 2019, it was a kind of very difficult time for the left. But I think it's safe to say, though, that this kind of politics of support for or against him really obscured from that broader question of what is the purpose of legal reform. Part of the power of the prosecutors is the limited rights that people have, teachers, workers, public officials, that makes it easy for them to exercise their power. That isn't the whole question, but that's an important part of it. And without that kind of broader social questions answered, then the type of reform that he wants to pursue, I think it's problematic. Here you see this sense, you saw a lot of art at this time, kind of like this, with Roh Moo-hyun's dream, Moon Jae-in's destiny, and Cho Guk's calling. He's sort of seen as kind of carrying on the legacy of democratization, if you will, and pursuing prosecution reform. But I think this kind of depiction, though, does obscure from those more substantive political questions of what is the purpose of legal reform? Is it actually enhancing equality in society? How come that isn't being considered? Meanwhile, it also allows the right wing to appropriate the discourse of fairness. It appoints Yoon Song-yeol, Moon's prosecutor general, as its candidate who had disagreed with prosecution reform and had quit over it. It's kind of like if Robert Mueller became the Republican candidate. That would still probably be a better world. But anyways, it's a bit like that. But he himself does not have a substantive vision of fairness. He even coupled it with misogyny and arguing things like the Ministry of Gender Equality gave women an unfair advantage above men. This in the country's largest wage gap and the gender gap and such. And so since then, there's been this idea that the prosecutor republic that in some ways fueled the Candlelight Revolution has returned, maybe not as vengeful or perhaps just as vengeful as it was during Park Geun-hye. A very crude simplification of these three kind of dilemmas, but I explore them there. A lot of them involve the imaginary the reform bloc has done, its coordination with labor, but also the resilient power of the conservative bloc and the strategies that the pro-democratic reformers taking to address it. So some concluding thoughts, right? One, the power of the prosecutor republic of the conservative bloc speaks to the need for pro-democratic actors to work as a bloc, right? It's not simply just the party. There is this need, I think, for unions, society organization, reformers, parties to work together. In general, there seems to be a preference for policies associated with social democracy. This kind of some of the contradictions of the Korean model, right? The preference for national level social dialogue bodies, for like social pacts, for the use of voice in designing an economic system, coupled with the preference for flexibilized Anglo-American labor markets. It's a weird kind of system, if you will, but not always the content of social and political struggle. So the idea of using those institutions to legitimize policy, but not really using those institutions, I think, in a substantive, egalitarian sense. A lot of the reformers I interviewed talk about this, like there's this great interest in like social democracy, but more as form rather than content, more as like an institution, but not the kind of social history that goes with that. So I think there's this problem then seen from the view of the integral state that many interesting reformers enter the state, but fail to strongly institutionalize alternatives. This is the theme that's come up in a lot of the recent literature. Lee Young-young's recent book, for instance, talks about similar problems about how progressives in the Democratic Party have failed to kind of build a control tower, a way to coordinate and advocate collectively for progressive change, and thus their kind of individual legacies lend legitimacy to liberal administrations, but they themselves feel kind of saddled down or not able to enact the change they want. So that raises the question, but what's next, or what a better idea of economic democracy, one that is more closely aligned with social justice might be. Back in 2012, there's this debate about finding of economic democracy or the welfare state being a provisional utopia, like an imaginary that may guide reformers to be more equal. Hong Gi-bin, who's an interesting writer who I quite like, kind of embraced this idea, which comes from Wigforth. He wasn't saying let's build a Swedish model, but let's try to push our imaginaries always to be more egalitarian, to sort of find something a bit more than simply just chaebol reform, kind of narrow compromise. So anyways, I think, yeah, there's this question of what the next model may be. I don't want to predict the future, but obviously this would involve a stronger alliance between labor and political parties. It's necessary, but I think doubtful. Until recently, the minor progressive parties like the Justice Party, I think, were a big source of hope, but they've been recently wiped out, in part due to the rise of the Turbulent Party, who's created his own party. That party, it must be said, supports revision of Korean labor law to finally address those restrictions on workers' rights with tool right. It's called the Yellow Envelope Law. You may have heard of it, but that raises the question of why wasn't that passed when they were in power, when they could have easily done it. And in opposition, the president will simply veto that. I think his record on anti-discrimination legislation too is also mixed. Then in terms of scholarship too, where else should we go? I think this is one way to study this situation. I think we should continue moving away from sort of ideal type celebratory praise of the developmental state to following a method that sort of follows the political projects of reformers and tries to use that to generate facts and data about Korea's political economic situation. Or at least that's the path that I think works. It works for me. I think it can work for other areas. That's something we can do as you become mature researchers yourselves, something to explore. I think I'll end it there. Went a bit longer in my jet lag state, but
Great. You have a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I want to raise a question about the Gramscian approach that you mentioned before in the slide. So when approaching through the Gramscian, when approaching through Gramscian or ways of thinking, I think a question arises as to how to deal with different modalities and different kinds of democracy. So when Gramsci assumes the dialectical process between the party leadership and the masses, the media, which provides information to the party member, party leaders, and also the party members, laborers, workers, and also this back and forth movement, dialectical back and forth movement is assumed in the Gramscian model when he talks about hegemony. But when we think about South Korean politics and economy in relation to the Gramscian model of hegemony, then a kind of very different type of media, unlike Gramsci, I think appears as a very strong force. So it is not the party members who give the information to the party leaders and the workers, but rather the mainstream media is kind of mediating between the people and the administrators or the politicians, and which are very distorting, sometimes very distorting and marginalizing the labor in a way very violent, like you expressed through the comic images that you introduced. So speaking of that, I want to ask how your Gramscian approach really addresses this question. And also you talk a lot of things about Incheon as well, Incheon Airport as a kind of failure of the reform movement. But the reason why Incheon Airport reform ended a failure was not just because of the mediocre treatment of this issue by the Moon Jae-in government, but rather because of the strong reactionary forces forming in the Incheon Airport based on this ideology of meritocracy. So in this case, I think it is more like I don't want to read that as a failure of the Moon Jae-in's reform drive, but rather as this constant reactionary move that really want to pull against the Moon Jae-in's reform movement. So there is a very big question of the media and how the reality is produced by the mainstream media and how the public reacts to the reality created by the mainstream media. I think it's very dire question to ask about when we talk about this labor reform. So I think that really is tied up to this Gramsci understanding of Gramsci as well. So I'd like to ask a question about that.
that was excellent question. I guess I'll take the second one first. Yeah, you are right to highlight some of the complexity of regularization at Incheon. So some of the critiques of that process, I think, have highlighted. They're not necessarily saying your policy totally failed. My point here is that regularization wasn't approached through dialogue. It was kind of mandated that each different ministries, different institutes could do it in their own way. And in that sense, like Moon didn't meet with the unions, and then there's this iconic photo of Moon meeting the workers. But I think what's interesting about that photo is he's not meeting their representatives. He's not meeting the unions. He's sort of directly meeting the workers. That itself is fine, but it shows that it wasn't necessarily seen as something you bargain with the employees. And so and the representatives. So there's a sense that that one of the sources of that, or or that resentment between people who are already regular, who are like, oh, why are you regularizing these people that didn't take the exam or they don't have worked as hard as we have? One of the reasons for that resentment is that there wasn't necessarily that strong dialogue-based model of regularization, right? Some ministries did involve unions and maybe had more success, but that it wasn't sort of treated as like something that social dialogue could do, or something that you negotiate more strongly with unions. It was sort of mandated, and thus that led to some of the resentment there. So it's complicated. I think it's this question of like what is included in social dialogue and what isn't, right? And there may have been greater use for it, if you will. How do we understand Gramsci? I mean, I'm mostly using Gramsci to open up the idea of the state away from this sort of austere theory of state autonomy, right? To open it up to its sort of relation and processes. I think there's like a more Leninist Gramsci, a more strict Gramsci that has a more delineated relations of how the party works. But I think I'm into the more kind of open Gramscianism, and I think that more open Gramsci would say, of course, cultural institutions like the media are extremely important, and that's all part of the battle, if you will, right? Gramsci often uses the term war of position, this idea of trying to influence these different institutions within civil society as a way to build governing. Obviously, that war would have has a long way to go when it comes to the power of conservative media in South Korea, but I think it's fine to do that in Korea.
I have a follow-up question about media.
Mhm.
So a good friend of mine who began with as a euphoric participant in the candlelight protests and strong supporter of women, and ended up being utterly disillusioned. We described his disillusionment in a very, what I think is a proper way. So he talked about it as the candlelight protests, the people, 16 million who participated in it, presenting women with this beautiful, huge, grand sword, which he then proceeded to break up into a million pieces. And these million pieces might have, created some sort of effect, but ended up not changing anything that mattered.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about that metaphor of the sword that, for this friend of mine who failed to wield and didn't even manage to strike a hobak with it, or move with, and thinking about whether, I mean, it's hindsight is always 20/20 and it's hypothetical, but whether the order in which the reform agenda was pursued might have been, differently arrayed and might have yielded better results. So, for example, the unification or reconciliation with Nor's issue, which was front-loaded under Moon administration. A lot of people argue that had he pursued the media reform first in the early days when the administration was very powerful, that would have been much better, and he would have had an easier time pursuing other reform items on the agenda. But then he managed not to do that, and conservative media, of course, remained exposed
Mhm.
at the end of his days in the Blue House. So whether prosecutorial reform and the media reform should have been front-loaded. That's the question.
No, I think that's a good one. I mean, I can't speak to those sectors, but I think like mostly I'm interested in the question of labor. I think that's the big missing thing, but call me naive, but I would love to see a stronger relationship between, rather than just appointing veteran trade unionists and these NGOs to kind of lead a dialogue body that says yes to policies you've already made. Before you're even elected, why not just sit down with labor and say, what do you want? And then do it. So I think I'm very naive to say, like, why didn't that happen? But maybe the belated embrace of the yellow envelope law is a sign that may be happening, but I'm not convinced that will happen if progressive bloc gets back into power. But certainly that would have made things easier and eliminated a lot of the friction that happened with the the Economic Social Labor Council, right? If you went into that being like, oh, right, you're going to fully ratify the ILO conventions and do good labor reform. I think that would have been. So I guess it's like the pre-election aspects of identifying the reform agenda and having a strong plan for what it is. But obviously those things are obstructed by the enormously complex relations within the party, lessons learned or not learned. So yeah, hindsight is 2020. The question is what's next?
Also the abbreviated like window of time that the Moon administration had transitioned,
Yeah,
but it's not the election.
yeah. I mean, I come out a bit crusty, I think, but I guess like in terms of like research methods, I do a lot of key informant interviews, and I have a lot of old colleagues, even friends, because I've been doing this a long time in the KCTU, and I kind of want them to read this book and be like, yeah, I agree with you. But I also know a lot of the people who went in and helped with the social dialogue body, and I can understand what they tried to do. And some of that has such great potential, right? This like really novel use of public interest and social dialogue that you don't see in other countries. Lots of great potential there. And so I kind of like if I could sit somewhere in between those two groups and they can both see something there, I'll be happy. But it's tricky. I sympathize with the enormous challenge of reform. It's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd like.
Thank you. I mean, okay. So thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. As a South Korean national and a student in policy, this is really interesting. My question was when you mentioned new reformers coming in, failing to come up with this alternative. I wonder if you have considered how true their motive is, like how true like their reforms, like they display their reforms as something like how true that is. Maybe this is because like I usually study authoritarian legacy authoritarianism. I always think about like how people falsify, but also like it can just go both ways. Like the regime could also falsify, and it could also apply through democratization as well. So I think like maybe that's one of the reasons why the reforms might not have had that strength that they are supposed to have. So I wonder if you have.
No, that's a great question. One of the reviews of the book was like this, right? Like, like, are you sort of attributing too much intention to actually follow through with these things? And I totally agree that people can and did work, I would say, to subvert some of these. Yeah, definitely subvert some of their power. But I think as a scholar, that doesn't mean we can't track a project and its intentions and critique it, right? So the economic democratization was a project, right? It doesn't mean we have to like uncritically praise it, but I think we can see what happened to it, and that one of our findings can be perhaps what you're calling a kind of lack of sincerity in implementation. But that doesn't mean we should like not that we should just ignore those projects. I think we should study them and see what they try to do to understand their limitations. But that's the kind of scholarship I'm interested in. Let's say this is what they wanted to do, and then look at its limitations. How was it imagined? How was it coordinated? What obstacles did it find in the face of the prosecutor republic, but also the internal complicated politics of the pro-democratic bloc? That's what I'm trying to do. And you can read it in more long form there. And this is very, very crude, like summary. It's not even everything I understand. And there's lots of missing stuff that other people can do, like North Korea.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask another question about the relationship between dialogue and emotional factors. So you also talked about the trauma of the labor unions in the 1997 is hindering the process of dialogue between the Moon administration and the labor union. So we can really talk about the dialogue as a good thing to really resolve these issues, resolve or continues the process of reforming. But we can also, I think about the ways in which emotions are really hindering the willingness to participate in the dialogue in the first place. And also returning back to the question of the media, I think is also instigating the emotions in a way that it is really making it impossible to, the dialogue between whatever parties are included in many ways. And this is another question, a separate question, is about the content. You talked about the content of the social and political reform is not so much highlighted rather than just as a slogan or blurry images of social reform. But I'm really curious to know how the solid information, solid understandings of social and political content could be circulated in the public. How is that really possible? Because from my perspective, many people can talk about the blurry images of the social reform, but they are not so much interested in going very deeper into the actual content of the policy, because the actual content of policy can also be very difficult to understand depending on what kind of stances you are. So yeah, that was another question.
Two more great questions. Thank you. Dialogue and emotional factors, the trauma of the grand social. So interestingly enough, the Moon announces he's going to revive the social dialogue body, and there's provisional social dialogue with all the unions and the people there, and it goes well. Ultimately, the KC2 doesn't endorse or join into the formal dialogue because its branch representatives reject participation. KC2 is a democratic union, and many of them, I think, remembered it. I don't think in that case it was like the conservative media like preventing that. So maybe that was more the emotional memory of what happened. And speaking to people in the KC at that time, they, like Moon Sung-yeon, the former Korean Democratic Labor Party official, he's the guy who chairing the social dialogue body. Park Tae-jun, these kind of really progressive people. The KC2 unionists actually regarded that as a problem. They were like, actually, the closeness between the people leading the dialogue body and the KC2 leadership that's actually not so good for us, we feel, or we fear that we could be coerced. It would be horrible to be coerced to do a bad agreement with those people. So emotionally, I'm not the person to probe them, but there's certainly strong emotional memories here that are prohibited. Once again, the KC2 does engage in social dialogue when it comes to minimum wage committee and other areas, but this panel, the kind of apex of dialogue body, they would not join, mostly because it was seen as like signing off on Moon's labor policies. And then he tried to use it to even revise those labor policies when faced with some criticism over being too generous on the minimum wage and reducing the work hours. Content, the way I interpret your question is how can like information on what alternative economic models be circulated? I guess that does involve the media. I mean, there's amazing independent media in Korea, and I think the pages of Shisa and Pression, No Cut, like all those different independent media are important sources of it, as are the vibrant like civil society organizations, groups like I was quite close to the Carl Polanyi Carl Polanyi Social Economy Research Institute. They get commissions from Seoul government to kind of study these different models. PSPD, some of the big NGOs have done that. Groups like there's so many like amazing small Yongguso type groups that do this. I guess it's like getting that information out there. I mean, I find the debate about alternatives much more active and interesting here, in Korea than here in America, or maybe I'm just reading the wrong sources, but something that's always really impressed me is like about, we were speaking over dinner about the legacy of elite institutions, but actually these informal institutes like NGO and civil society groups are the source of an enormous amount of creative and rigorous and interesting intellectual production. There's really not enough of an appreciation of that, although there is some scholarship on it. But how do you amplify their voice when the mainstream, when those big papers control so much of the media environment? Yeah, it's a question. Yeah, but it is important to get that information.
I would like to ask some different question about labor.
Yep.
maybe you can relate to the situation in UK as well about this, which is about immigration.
Mhm.
So because the labor market in Korea will be a lot replaced by immigrant workers, it is being replaced by it. And then that sort of caused unionized labor, their voices kind of being not representing the whole body. They're not representing the part-time workers. It's getting better, especially Minnochong has gotten so much better on that, but they are not yet representing the immigrant workers. And then I know that's a big issue in Britain as well. So and then there is no conversation about this, even like recent pilot programs for Filipino nannies. So they were, the minimum wage was applied to them, and then that was biggest push, that the wage was too high for ordinary houses. So who's the victim there? So like, what do you imagine, this kind of situation will evolve in Korea? And then whether the discourses about labor is strengthened enough to sort of be minimally protect the immigrant workers.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have all the answers to it, but it's an important one to ask. I think the limit, so I just said a few minutes ago that the design of the social dialogue body was super interesting in that it tried to include novel public interest, right? So not just union, business, government, but like women workers, youth workers, disabled workers, representatives in the deliberative process. I think that's great. Migrant workers were not included in that. So it spoke to the limits, I think, of who a worker is being conceived of in that policy. Yeah, in a lot of countries, you do have rising xenophobia, labor not addressing issues. And the record of Korean Union is mixed. Like, when I first went to Korea in 2001, so it's a whole other story, but I became very close friends with the Equality Trade Union Migrants branch. It was like a union of undocumented migrant workers, supported by the KCTU during the kind of Dam Byung-ho leadership. I was so impressed by that. This idea of like, sure, we're not legal, but we're going to form a union, damn it. And there's a lot of support among that progressive faction of the KCTU. But unfortunately, when the leadership shifts to a more nationalist direction, they withdraw their support. So labor has a mixed record there in Korea. I don't know what the future is. That turn towards, a lot of the migrant workers to Korea were either to like light industrial factories or marriage migration to agricultural areas. That kind of labor issue of foreign domestic workers is I think a really interesting area to study in the context of Korea. I haven't done it, but this sort of the ways in which like labor is exploited, or how the state will then start to navigate global care chains and the kind of new geographies and contestation regulation there is a fascinating topic. I'd love to read more about that, but certainly it's going to be a big issue. Yeah. So how can you build inclusion into both union models, or I mean, not everything needs to be addressed through a union, but different types of dialogue bodies, different types of associations. Certainly the struggles to create the employee permit system in the early 2000s may provide a model. Korea used to not have this kind of work permit system, but a fake kind of trainee system, and a lot of activism made it institutionalize a modern work permit system, which is exploitative, but not as exploitative as the training system once was. So maybe something similar will happen, but still the migrant workers groups are still are arguing for the pretty basic rights, right? To change employer and have amnesty. Anyways, all right.
No, it's open question.
Now there undergrad students here who actually shared with me some fabulous questions, but I think perhaps they're too shy to ask. So now's the time if any of you would like to ask. Only if you'd like to.
In the back.
I just want to ask, kind of like what this means, residency and kind of how we still unable to make a lot of, or unable to make, reform. My question was kind of like, if the Silver incident and the candlelight revolution were kind of not enough to put into motion something of a tangible reform and only just the reform. One thing in the future would really be able to highlight that. Like if the people want it, and the people are the voters, like hypothetically, and if new democratized governments.
Mhm.
And what do the people have to do to get?
Yeah, I mean, once again, like there is a bit of a glass half full story. Like there has been reform, people were punished, then many of them pardoned. There's the promotion of regularization through this subsidiaries or through these indefinite term contracts. That's better than being illegally dispatched to a company. So there is, I think there has been reform, but maybe it hasn't. The point is that it hasn't filled that desire for a very substantive change, be it like a kind of solid social democracy or more equal society. How societies change is complex. That's why we need relational and processual approaches to politics rather than ideal types. History doesn't always come in the same way twice, so I don't know if there'll be Candlelight Revolution Part 2. Maybe there will be. But I think essentially that kind of hard work of coordination, articulating a vision, and then trying to implement it when you get the chance to, how will be fleshed out. It's a good question. I guess the point is that it isn't all or nothing. Things have happened. There's more social insurance than there used to be. There's some more interesting projects, but yeah, but maybe they weren't everything.
Glass half full is a good place to end. So thank you so very much. I learned a ton just